Chinese-speaking world. And in very intensive work by Chinese archaeologists in the last 2 decades have brought to light what Kircher described as the persistence of this Great Wall constructed at that time. Now, again, as I've already mentioned, Kircher couldn't possibly have known that these aspects of the monument survived, but there they are on the Chinese landscape, in a much eroded form, admittedly. But nevertheless, this intensive survey, often in very remote regions, allows us to see the walls that were constructed at that date. These ones are all from the very western end, and these were done in a survey by Gansu provincial archaeologists in 2007. This is actually slightly later. But the important point here, the one that I want to return to repeatedly, is that this is all of these projects throughout the 2,000-year span of wall building are done with reference to precedent. They're done with textual reference to precedent, but they're also done, as this photograph shows, with reference to the physical presence of the wall on the ground. The triangular cross-section mound, the rather low grass-covered mound that you can see on the inside of this photograph is a Han Dynasty rampart, so a century or two after the Qin construction that we've been talking about. The one on the outside, with a much more sheer, it's survived with much more sheer surface without vegetation on it. That's a Ming Dynasty earthen construction. So there they are, 1,500 years later, following the line of the Han Dynasty wall. So in that sense, it is very much a continuously maintained feature of the landscape. Again, Kircher was right, and our debunking of the myth is only, the necessary is one that we can't take too far. Not only did Meng Tian build walls towards the northern end of the Great River Loop, there was also constructed a highway traveling from the Qin capital, which is down on the bottom limb of that rectangle of space, up north in order to service the wall, to service the garrisons which were built up there. And that's not a monument that's easy to see at all on the ground. But from aerial photographs, including this one done by during a survey by the National Museum of China in 2005, shows an enormous strip of land that was flattened in order to provide access to this wall. Because building the wall required a supply line going back to the agricultural heartland in order to feed the huge numbers of people who are up there, both building it and maintaining it subsequently. And that's what that thin strip through, again, very underpopulated regions is that you can see on the photograph there. Just so you have a sense where some of these places are. I'm going to try and use this one here. There we go. So Lin Tao, remember the passage from Sima Qian's record of the historian? It mentions this wall of 10,000 li, beginning in Lin Tao in the west. Well, that's Lin Tao down there, on the leftmost of those pin drops there, and stretching all the way to, well, the peninsula that you can see stretching down south westwards up in the top corner is the Liaodong Peninsula. So that's the span over which these constructions were built in the 3rd century BC. The photographs that you saw on the previous slide, including that one, are all within the great straight road that goes from the Qin capital north up to service the walls, is at that location, somewhere in that location up there at the top, in the modern city of Ordos. The Qin capital, by the way, I forgot to mention, is down at the bottom there. So a straight road running, that's about 400 miles, 400 of our modern regular miles, from the Qin capital up to the limit where the river bends over and where Meng Tian was building his fortifications. One other very, very wonderful shot of something that probably on the ground would not be terribly spectacular, but from the air is an absolutely spectacular Qin period defensive settlement found during that same survey. For scale, you've got some modern buildings down at the, again, I'm having trouble moving the mouse, but down in the bottom right-hand corner, there are some modern buildings down there. So absolutely dwarfed by this Qin dynasty construction. So as Kircher said, it's persisted through time as a great mass. One more shot. again, within the Yellow River Loop over towards the southwest side, the Qin Dynasty Great Wall snaking across the hills, still very, very visible in an aerial photograph. And they're down on the ground. In this case, constructed not with earth. The techniques for construction vary according to what the building materials that are available locally, but here we've got dry stone walling. There's no mortar between those slabs. They're piled up with the rubble in between and then the neatly arranged rocks on the side. And that's that same stretch of wall within the Great Bend in the Yellow River, built during the Qin Dynasty. But as we've said, there's a perpetual note of criticism. So spectacular achievement to build these great walls around the Qin Empire. But Sima Qian, who provides us with that account, adds his own, as he always does at the end of each chapter, he adds his own commentary on what's gone before. He's gathered together his historical sources and he's given us the facts, and then he adds a reflective note at the end of each of his chapters. And this is what he has to say about the Great Straight Road and the Qin fortifications. I traveled to the northern frontier, returning by the straight road, so returning by that road you saw in the satellite photograph, and observed on my travels the forts of the Long Wall constructed by the Qin, ringing the mountains and blocking the valleys. When Qin had first eliminated the rival rulers, the hearts of the people were not yet settled. So again, this question of the priorities of the rulership, the priorities of state building by those in power, and the ethical duty towards the populations involved. Who are the ones who have to do the building? So the hearts of the people were not yet settled, and their bruises and wounds had not yet healed from the conflict with the other states, from the domino toppling of those warring states at the end of the warring states period. Yet the distinguished General Meng Tian, the man who we're told is responsible for the war, did not take the opportunity for forceful remonstrance, for addressing the commoners' needs, for caring for the old and the orphaned, and for building harmony among the masses. Instead, he went along with the plans for mobilizing labor for this enormous construction project. Thus, was it not fitting that he and his brother met with punishment? And we'll get to this in a second. What was that nonsense about offending the veins of the earth? Well, there's a little bit of a story there. And this is all part of the biography of Meng Tian that occurs in that chapter in the records of the historian. Meng Tian, having achieved this spectacular feat of leading an army and a construction crew to complete these monumental defenses in the north, wins great fame for himself for doing so. He's a prized general for having done this. But with the succession of the monarchy, the Qin emperor dies, and his subsequent replacement has a very negative view of many of the prominent figures who were prominent under the first Qin emperor. And Meng Tian is in fact asked to commit suicide, and the criticism that is offered, or a trumped-up charge if ever there was one, was that the construction of this monument had offended, there's the phrase, had offended the veins of the earth, that the building of this monument had cut through those veins of the land, a mystical, entirely trumped-up charge. But that's what the chapter by Sima Qian has to say about it, and he ends by making the point that not that he doesn't deserve this criticism, that he doesn't deserve punishment, and his brother also loses favor with the new emperor. It's not that they don't deserve it; they deserve it for something entirely different. What they deserve criticism for is the immense expense of human life in building these fortifications, and not the nonsense about cutting through the veins of the earth. So there we go. We've oscillated back in the space of 100 years from a very optimistic construction project to a very negative statement by China's first great historian about wall building. The Han, too, though, invested very, very heavily in managing the threat to the nomadic pastoral populations to their north. They also built very, very long defensive lines out into the north and particularly towards the west, much further than the Qin had done. And they maintained those with supply lines and with a very elaborate system of administration. And so many of the administrative documents from those regions have been excavated in the 20th century and provide a very detailed vision of what it meant to administer these outposts very, very far away from the capital. I'm not going to dwell on the Han fortifications, though, but I'm going to jump to a slightly less often emphasized period of wall building in the period of disunity between the Han Dynasty and the Tang that followed several centuries later. The wall building that I want to look at now, again, any excuse to get an item from the galleries into the slideshow. Nothing to do with Great Walls, other than the fact that this is from the Northern Wei. So this is from one of the dynasties that ruled parts of North China after in the period of disunity between the fall of the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. Now they were, amongst other things, preoccupied for long periods of time with the Buddhist religion. They constructed very dramatic Buddhist cave temples that survive today in both Datong in northern Shanxi and in Luoyang down in Henan. So the two of the most famous repositories of stone monuments that survive today were constructed under this particular monarchy. They were themselves people of the northern steppe who had moved they were originally not an ethnically Chinese group, but they had moved into the northern periphery of the Chinese heartland after the fall of the Han Dynasty. And this is one of their, from right at the end of their reign period. This is, you can see in the gallery today. There we go. That's where their capital was. As you can see, we've moved east ever so slightly from our previous preoccupation, which was with the Yellow River Bend. We're now outside the Yellow River Bend. Datong is the modern name of the city where the Northern Wei had their first capital, and where they had their capital until 494 BC. And in 494 CE, and it was in that year that they made the decision to move that capital, to relocate that capital down to Luoyang. That's what it was called. That's what it's always been called. It's still called Luoyang today. Again, a span of about 400 miles, a very long move towards the Chinese, into the Chinese heartland, into the agricultural zone, and away from their steppe origins. And at about the same time as that move was taking place, we have another very interesting text, a memorial by a man called Gao Liu, who was a prime minister to the state of to the Northern Wei state, advocating building walls. And again, in this particular text, we see nothing at all of the negative side. Or we, in fact, find a very optimistic, very upbeat assessment of what it means in human terms to go about building walls. So let's have a look at that. This is his memorial, now as I say, about the same time as the move of the capital from the edge of the steppe zone down southwards into the Chinese heartland. They now have the problem of what to do about their northern defenses. And he begins the memorial by saying, it would be appropriate now to follow old precedent. So again, old precedent. This idea of wall building is a continuous one. It never goes away entirely. Every one of these dynasties who's trying to maintain an agricultural society administered with dense populations in cities, administered by a literate bureaucracy, all have this problem of dealing with the people who are not doing that, who are distributed to their north, who are raiding, and much more mobile than they are. So he says it would be appropriate now to follow old precedents to construct long walls, there's that word again, changchong, in continuous use throughout this period, to the north of the 6 garrisons. So they had 6 garrisons distributed in the north of the region which they occupied, to prevent incursions from the north. Although it would be a burden in terms of short-term effort, it would be of long-term advantage, and once complete, would benefit 100 generations. So a very optimistic statement about the value of wall building. Not at all dissuaded by previous statements about the inadequacy of these kinds of constructions. I'm not going to translate the whole passage, but he advises the training of a force of 60,000 men in this case, and advocates that they meet once every 10 days. They're presumably drawn from an agricultural population. They meet once every 10 days in the capital to practice, to get ready for this expedition to the north. 20,000 archers, 20,000 halberdiers, and 20,000 cavalry. So a limited use of horses, but with also this very substantial infantry. If the nomads come to resist, so he advocates in a particular month, they're going to, in the early summer, they're going to move north to take on the nomad threat. And if the nomads come to resist when we move north, we meet them in decisive battle. If they don't come,